What is the Hebrew Bible actually about? There's tons of poetry and a lot of rules and sacrifices that nobody really keeps today. It's confusing.
Yeah, it can be confusing. The Hebrew Bible or Christian Old Testament is an ancient collection of many different scrolls written by different authors over thousands of years. But all these scrolls are connected because they're all about one story.
But there's way more than just one story in the Hebrew Bible.
Right, but all those little stories are part of a bigger story arc.
Okay, so over the course of thousands of years, one big story is being followed, and all the little stories make up the main narrative?
Yeah, exactly.
That makes sense. So the way a story's plot usually works is it begins with everything at peace, and then some conflict happens, and that causes a problem. Then the rest of the story is all about how the problem gets fixed. Then after the problem gets fixed, there can be peace again, and sometimes it's even better. Is that how the plot of the Hebrew Bible works?
Pretty much, in the beginning, everything's good, then there's a massive problem introduced that the rest of the story is about.
Okay, so how does the story go?
It begins with God creating a good world. He creates humans, places them in a garden, and puts them in charge of the world. And God is actually present in the garden with the humans. He tells them to take care of the world on his behalf. Even though they're supposed to trust God and take care of it the way that he wanted them to, they decided that they should be the ones to decide what's good and evil instead of God.
That's what sin is, right?
Yeah, the Bible uses some different words for going against what God says is good, like sin, transgression, and iniquity.
Okay, so sin is what starts the conflict.
Right. When these humans decide what's good and evil for themselves instead of trusting God's way, that brings evil into the world.
That makes sense. We can be pretty selfish, and we usually disagree about what's good and evil.
Yeah, and that's exactly how it is in the biblical story. The humans are really bad at deciding good and evil and always seem to make things worse. So, after bringing evil into the world that they were supposed to take care of, God tells them what the consequences are. God tells them they're going to die and then separates them from himself.
Okay, so there's a few problems. There's evil in the world. God and humans are separated, and the humans are doomed to die. So the rest of the Hebrew Bible must be about getting evil out of the world and restoring a relationship between God and humans so they can live.
Yes, and that's exactly what God says is going to happen. Even as he was telling them the consequences of their sin, he gave them hope by telling them he had a rescue plan.
What's the plan?
God said the plan was to use the woman's descendant to rescue them from evil, but her descendant would be struck and suffer in the process. The biblical story actually zooms in on the woman's descendant, and most of the smaller biblical stories follow his ancestors until his arrival.
Is the woman's descendant the Messiah?
Yep, he's given many titles and responsibilities, but Messiah is what most people know him as.
So all the stories like Noah, Abraham, Joseph, and King David are stories about the Messiah's ancestors.
Several of them are direct ancestors. Some aren't direct ancestors, but they foreshadow what he'll be like. And some of the smaller stories aren't directly about him at all, but they do all add to the story's plot, which is all about the rescuer.
Wait, this makes sense to me. But are you sure this is how the authors meant the story to be understood?
Great question. Yeah, they don't leave it up for interpretation. They tell us clearly this is what it's about. God told the prophet Ezekiel that the soul who sins dies. And the prophet Isaiah said, "Your iniquities have made a separation between you and your God."
Well, that's kind of bad news for everyone. I don't know anyone who's never done wrong ever.
Right, and that's exactly what the authors noticed too. The teacher in the book of Ecclesiastes said, "There is not a righteous person on earth who always does good and never sins."
So how does the Messiah rescue people from evil, and why is he going to be struck?
The prophet Isaiah answers both of those questions. He said that the woman's descendant was going to be pierced for our transgressions and crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was on him, and by his wounds we are healed.
Oh wow, so he's actually going to save people by being struck. He's going to take the punishment that we deserve.
Right, and it's clear that it will be the ultimate punishment, death.
I get that he's going to die in our place, but how does he get rid of evil in the world?
So Psalm 1 and 2 are all about God's master plan. These Psalms tell us that God's plan is to install his own son as king of the whole world. He calls this king his Messiah. He tells us that his son will be a good king who will destroy evil, but anyone that gives his allegiance to him will live.
Oh, okay, so the Messiah's death won't rescue everyone, just the people who follow the good king. That makes sense. If people refuse to follow the good king, they'll just keep deciding good and evil for themselves and keep bringing evil into the world.
Yep, that's why the prophet Daniel said, "Many of those who sleep in the dust will wake, these to everlasting life, and these to everlasting contempt."
In other words, the people who trust the Messiah and follow him will be healed and get life forever, and people who refuse to follow him won't. Wait, but if the Messiah gets the death penalty in place of us, how and when are we supposed to follow him as king?
Well, the same prophecies that tell us the Messiah will die for our sins also teach that he will experience life after that. So the Messiah gives his life in our place, and then somehow he'll be brought back to life.
So what I'm getting is, the Hebrew Bible teaches that all humans have done something wrong in their lives. But doing something wrong is a really big deal to God, because it actually brings evil into God's good world. And the punishment for rebelling against God and trying to take his position as decider of good and evil is death. But God's Son, the Messiah, will take our punishment on himself so that we can have life forever with God, just like it was in the garden.
Right, if you trust and follow the Messiah.
How do you actually do that, though?
The biblical story makes it very clear that following God isn't about keeping rules or just being obedient. It's about placing your trust in him and devoting yourself to him. That's why when we see men like David fall into horrible sins like sexual immorality and murder, sins that according to God's law deserve the death penalty, God forgives them when they genuinely confess their evil to him and turn away from their own self-centered desires to follow him.
Okay, so I follow the Messiah by turning away from trusting myself as king of my life, making my decisions based on my desires, and say, actually, I trust that God's way is better, believing that he is good.
Exactly, and that's the message of the Hebrew Bible.